Hello, and thank you for joining our third annual Day with DISA. Before the session gets started, let's go over a few things. A copy of the presentation will be available to download once the session has ended under the Materials section. If you have questions about the information in this session, enter them in the Q&A section below, and the speaker will answer them once the session has ended. If we don't get to your question, we'll reach out to you at the end of the conference. If you have questions about the topics or trends that are mentioned throughout Day with DISA and how they pertain to your company, and you'd like to reach out to one of our team members directly, hit the chat icon at the bottom of daywithdisa.com and you'll be connected directly with one of our team members. Thank you for attending live. Each of our live attendees is eligible for our prize drawing at the end of the conference. And each session that you attend live increases your chances of winning either a Nintendo bundle or a brand new iPhone 12. Finally, I'd like to take this time to thank all of our sponsors for their participation in Day with DISA. Specifically, I'd like to call out CRL, our title sponsor for 3 years running. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, OraSure, Quest Diagnostics, SAMHSA Safety, and Psychomedics. All of our sponsors' support is greatly appreciated. With that, let's get started. Enjoy your session.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this session of Day with DISA. Today, we'll be presenting an oral fluid industry update with one of the leaders in oral fluid testing, OraSure. We've got two very experienced presenters in Brian Feeley, the Director of Sales with more than 35 years of experience in the drug testing field, including over 23 years experience with OraSure. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, and happy to be doing this for your customers and for DISA, and great that you guys are doing this.
Thanks, Brian. We also have Jackie Pirone, the Risk Assessment Program Leader for OraSure, with more than 25 years of experience in the drug testing field, including more than 10 years with OraSure. Jackie, how are you doing today?
Very good, Thomas. Thanks very much for having us. I know we're all virtual this year. It's kind of a new and different year for us, but we're really excited to present some updated information on oral fluid testing.
Well, we're excited to hear it. Brian, with that being said, you want to go ahead and kick this off?
My pleasure, Thomas. So thanks again, everybody, for attending this session, and thanks again to DISA. This is awesome to see you guys doing this at this time of in our world where things are so crazy and people aren't, getting together like we used to. DISA's finding a way to pull us together and do a great educational event like this, and it's much appreciated. So the agenda today is going to cover 5 areas. I'm going to talk about oral fluid briefly in terms of some of the background information and some positive rates and trends in the industry. Jackie's going to talk about the other areas here, SAMHSA guidelines, an update on COVID, and both in terms of testing during this COVID time and COVID itself. And then we'll do some Q&A. So first, I wanted to just review what is oral fluid. There's still a lot of folks out there that ask this, and they're not as familiar with it as they'd like to be. So, keeping it very simple, oral fluid and saliva, the terms are sometimes confused. They're really used interchangeably. They are different materials to some degree, but basically they're the same material that's used in most of the drug tests out there, whether somebody calls it saliva or they call it oral fluid. And the material comes really from the bloodstream, so it's a filtrate of your blood. It's a secretion of several glands, major glands in the mouth, that end up producing this substance that we're able to test for. So the drugs appear in oral fluid, again, from the bloodstream, literally within minutes of someone using a drug. We're able to test for both the parent and the metabolites. Sometimes a little confusion about that. It really depends on what we're looking for and how we design our immunoassay to work. So most of ours are designed to pick up the parent drug because that's what you find mostly in blood. But in some cases, you find the metabolite coming back over into oral fluid, just like you do in the blood sample. And in terms of how the device is collected, we'll go through that in the next slide, but generally you provide a sample onto a swab and then it goes into a vial. The key takeaway here, though, is how easy and quick an oral fluid sample is to collect, and the fact that they're all directly observed collections, which is really important in the drug testing field today. So this slide just kind of shows a few of the devices that are used out there. You know, most of them have a pad that you collect an oral fluid sample onto. That pad is left in the mouth for a period of time, either a designated time, like with Intercept on the bottom left. That's a 5-minute collection. Some of the newer devices, our new one, I2, and then the QuantaCell device have a little blue dye that forms in a window. You have some devices like the one on the far right that actually is a collection for saliva. So you spit into the top part and it divides it into two, and that doesn't have a pad or a buffer in it. But most of them are really quick, easy to do. They go into some sort of a vessel that's then shipped to the laboratory to do the drug testing part. The drug testing is done using immunoassay technology, very similar to the way a urine drug test is done. And that is then based on positive, negative, determined whether or not it goes on for mass spec confirmation testing if it's a presumptive positive. So very much like the way a urine drug screen is done. This slide just shows, for an illustration here, how Intercept is performed. You can see this woman has the device in her mouth with the pad facing down. So from a training standpoint, you can go through this and see, okay, I can see the flag is facing up. It's easy to know that she's got it in the right position. So that's the swabbing step, and then the device goes down into the vial. It gets snapped, and the lid is put back on, and a chain of custody seal is put over top of the vial. So it's real quick and easy, and can be done really almost anywhere, anytime. And that's really important with today's environment that we're in. There's sometimes issues with getting to collection sites and hours of operation, and the many things that people are struggling with in terms of getting a drug test done. Oral fluid can help. So it's a great way to use oral fluid in this time, and in the future, we expect just to see somewhat of a changing landscape in the way drug testing is done, with alternative matrices probably playing a bigger role than they ever have. So again, in terms of the benefits, really easy to collect it. All collections are directly observed, which you don't always have with other means of drug testing, either because it's not practical or not allowed. The neat part about oral fluid is it can be done right there with your donor, whether it's an applicant for a position, or it's a random test, or post-accident existing employee. They're all directly observed. So you don't need restrooms. It gets around this issue of shy bladder, which I think is pretty well known in the industry to cause some pretty big delays. It really saves the amount of time that someone is away from the job, because you can get the collection done quicker. It reduces time, which is cost. It's really difficult to beat an oral fluid test, and also you can't dilute an oral fluid sample intentionally or unintentionally, which is really important. So there are ways that people can intentionally dilute their sample, their urine, by drinking a certain amount of fluid prior to their test. Oral fluid can't be diluted because it's a filtrate of your blood, so it's a major advantage from that standpoint as well. And then probably a real key one is the fact that oral fluid picks up recent drug use. You're really talking about something that someone did recently in the last hours or day prior to their drug test, which really ties nicely to potential impairment. Now, we can't say, and no one can really say, the result of a drug test means impairment. That may come someday in the future, but really oral fluid and blood are really the two closest things where you can say that. In fact, you can say it for blood because that's been pretty well proven, but it's not very practical to collect. So oral fluid is really the next best thing to getting as close to potential impairment as you can, which is really important in post-accident and suspicion type cases. And then recently, as we all know, with social distancing and the things that have come about because of COVID, it's really important to have some means of doing a test where that social distancing can be maintained, and oral fluid can be done very nicely that way in terms of how you run the collection, putting the devices out separately for someone to be able to get. You don't have to be involved in that touching of that process. The donor does it all themselves, goes into the vial, and it gets packaged up, and really the collector or the administrator of it stays pretty clear of that whole process. This is a slide we've used from time to time. It kind of illustrates that window of detection that people often ask about. And, you know, in some cases we hear people have concerns about oral fluid because they think the window of detection is really, really short. With laboratory-based oral fluid testing, the window of detection is not super short like you do sometimes get with instant tests. And in fact, it's really good at picking up recent use, as I just mentioned, but typically good for out to a few days after the use of a drug. Most of the data that we've seen from the field and studies that have been done show that you can pick up most of the drugs for at least 1 to 2 days after someone had used it. Marijuana is a little shorter. It's really in that 1 to 2 day window. But when you look at the positive rates, which I'll show in a second, that really does not affect what you're picking up in terms of positives. In fact, we get more with oral fluid. So, and this just kind of shows the different values of the different tools that are out there. So urine, oral fluid, you know, picks it up quick and drops off after a few days. Urine takes a few hours for it to get into the bladder and into the urine sample so that you can find the drug. That's after, you know, several days. Most people will say up to about a week or so for urine testing. And then hair, of course, picks up several weeks later and goes out for several months. So they all have different value capabilities within that chain to say, okay, what is your drug testing program really about, and what sample type is best for you to be using in the different scenarios that you're up against. So this chart, you'll have access to this presentation, so I'm not going to go through all the details on this chart, but it's kind of a nice one to print out and use. We've had a number of people compliment us on the way this is laid out, because it kind of shows the attribute on the left, and then what's the difference between urine, hair, and oral fluid in terms of those different attributes. And, you know, really without going through all the lines on this, bottom line is, you know, oral fluid tends to be easier to collect. It's got that non-invasive aspect to it. It does have the recent use component that you don't get necessarily with urine and hair. And, you know, it has some benefits to it in terms of the tampering and the shy bladder, as I already mentioned. They're all accurate methodologies in terms of, you know, providing an accurate result. Now that we're getting into the DOT world and the federal world of testing, and the guidelines are out, we're allowed to do oral fluid, or will be as soon as the implementation period is over, to do oral fluid for regulated testing, and DOT will follow, and Jackie will talk about that a little more. One of the other pieces that I will touch on is under cost consideration. So we sometimes get the question, well, what does it cost to do an oral fluid drug test? And really, you know, we look at it from the standpoint of the ROI of a testing methodology, which means how much am I paying for the collection, the lab test, the MRO fee, the time away from work, all of those things, the indirect costs that are associated with this, not just the direct costs. And at the end of the day, when you look at that, if there are a fair amount of costs tied up in collections and time away from work and things that are some of the hassles related to getting people drug tested using urine screening, for example, in those cases, oral fluid actually has a higher ROI and a benefit from a cost standpoint. And you really need to look at that on an individual case-by-case basis. So what is the menu for oral fluid? Basically, all the same drugs that you can test for in urine, you can pick up in oral fluid, and hair for that matter. All the common drugs, your NIDA 5 panel, as we used to call it, right? Marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines. The methamphetamine and amphetamine classes are typically split out with an oral fluid drug screen. And we do that for a reason. Basically, you know, the tradition is to have amphetamines grouped into one class, and you develop antibodies that pick up amphetamines, which is amphetamine and methamphetamine combined. With oral fluid, most of us break those out, because by doing so, we're able to create antibodies that are more specific for amphetamine and methamphetamine, and also pick up ecstasy within that methamphetamine class. So that's why sometimes you'll hear people talk about oral fluid. It's not a 5 panel, it's really a 6 panel to get both of those picked up. But additional drugs can be used, such as barbs and benzos and methadone. Oxycodone, of course, has become super important these days. In some of our labs, clinical reference lab, for example, is one of them that has added things like K2 and spice and bath salts and buprenorphine and fentanyl. And you can even test for tobacco in an oral fluid panel. That's metabolite is called cotinine. So that's the drug testing panel. Just to move to a couple slides that I want to mention are from Quest Diagnostics and their index. They do a great job of tabulating oral fluid, urine, hair, positive rates, and adulteration examples where samples are tampered with. They break it down in geographies. It's just a great index. So this slide shows the positive rates for oral fluid versus urine. Back in 2017, this was tabulated. And what they showed in this data was that the urine positive rates and the oral fluid positive rates have become quite different. And I'll show that a little more in a second, but we're seeing about double the overall positive rates with laboratory-based oral fluid testing compared to urine. As you can see in that circular pie chart, 10.5% positive versus 4.9 for the general workforce population. The positive rates in the chart show that there's a big difference, in particular for marijuana. We're picking up 2 to 3 times the number of positives or more than urine is. And, you know, specifically, we've been told, and we believe that that ties to the fact that that aspect of doing directly observed collections is really important, because it's very difficult to subvert, adulterate, substitute, dilute a sample, an oral fluid sample, where that's not necessarily always the case for urine. So that's really important with marijuana. And for the other classes, we're seeing some higher rates for cocaine, and the amphetamine, methamphetamine classes are very much the same. Opiates is similar, maybe a little higher with oral fluid, because we do tend to pick up the 6-acetyl morphine a little better in oral fluid than urine. So overall, these positive rates have helped with the whole SAMHSA guideline process, because I think it's been, you know, oral fluid testing has been on the market for 20 years now, but it's getting really, really validated now by the fact that SAMHSA has come out with guidelines, the DOT is going to put out guidelines, and oral fluid is really coming into its own now. Since that was 2017, I just wanted to show 2018 and 19 from their index, and really continues to show the same differences between the general workforce population, urine, oral fluid, and hair, where oral fluid and hair are still showing to be significantly higher than laboratory-based urine screening. Of course, these positive rates will differ by industry. So whether you're in construction or oil and gas, or whether you're in retail, you look within those sectors and you'll see some differences in terms of positive rates that you will get. But in the general workforce population, this is what we're seeing. And then in terms of the positive rates for THC, I referred to this just a slide or two ago, how we're seeing that difference between urine, hair, and oral fluid really separating themselves over time. You know, you look at this slide and basically it's showing urine, oral fluid, and hair in the 3 different colors, right? So you're seeing urine and in green at the bottom there, staying relatively flat over time from 2007 up to 2017. Positive rates, yeah, a little bit of fluctuation. But in yellow is hair, and in the blue bars, you're seeing oral fluid. They really start to differentiate from 2012, 13, 14, 15, and onward. And, you know, what's happening during that time period? Well, that's the time that marijuana is becoming legalized, or further use in medicinal use or prescription marijuana. And so what's happening is more people are using it in more different states and more different workplaces. And so the positive rates are going up again because of the difficulty in subverting these samples. We're picking things up in the oral fluid and hair that urine is missing, because frankly, people know how to beat their urine drug screen. That's one of them. And the marijuana is becoming stronger, and that's also playing a role in the overall increase in positivities that we're seeing out there. So lastly, I think I have this last slide, maybe one more. This sort of shows the positive rate by reason for testing. And we're sometimes asked, you know, is oral fluid better for one means of testing or another? How does it vary between post-accident and pre-employment? So this is very interesting data, because this is from 2019. Quest showed what they're finding in terms of positive rates by reason for testing, specifically post-accident, pre-employment, and random. And what you can see with oral fluid testing is that basically we're seeing very good positive rates with pre-employment, which some folks may have thought that wasn't necessarily going to be the case, because after all, people know how to prepare for their drug screen, right? They shouldn't be coming in positive, and oral fluid has a shorter window of detection. But the bottom line is we are seeing good positive rates with pre-employment testing. It is a part of this that we think is an element of surprise, that people don't always know what kind of drug test they're going to be faced with. So they come into the workplace and they may have figured out how to beat their other test, and then an oral fluid test is sprung on them. So that, combined with the fact that we are seeing higher marijuana rates, is giving us these higher pre-employment rates. And we're seeing nice positive rates for post-accident and random as well. And one of the reasons that, you see the oral fluid guidelines allowing for all these different forms of testing with oral fluid is because these positive rates look good across the different means of testing. And then lastly, the different segments that we see people adopting oral fluid in is very broad. We started this out in the year 2000, and manufacturing and retail were two of the biggest spaces that we got started in with some of our lab partners and third-party administrators. And then that expanded into hospitality, and lately we've seen a lot of construction and oil and gas, which I know this DISA and the customers on this call a lot of them are in that space. So we've had some really good adoption in that industry, and oral fluid seems to be helping them in numerous ways. And then, of course, logistics and distribution, and even use in staffing and some of the other industry, schools and whatnot. So that kind of wraps up my slides. I'm going to turn this over to Jackie Pirone right now, who's going to talk about SAMHSA oral fluid guidelines first. Jackie?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. That's, I think all those slides are very good background. And I know you've mentioned the DOT and SAMHSA a few times. So we're going to actually get right into the SAMHSA guidelines, kind of just a general overview. There's been some movement in the last month or so regarding hair testing, so I'm going to touch on that as well. So if you think back to this time last year, it was actually October 25th of last year, I believe. So roughly about the same time frame, give or take, SAMHSA actually finally, after a lot of years, released the final oral fluid guidelines. I think many of us have been following, Thomas mentioned how long I've been in the drug testing industry. I think pretty much from the beginning of time when I started in the drug testing industry, HHS and SAMHSA and DTAB had all been talking about, what they were going to do to look at things other than urine. And we're finally getting some traction, both for oral fluid and hair as well. So what now we have is the guidelines for oral fluid and urine are in their final stages. And so that creates basically two separate mandatory guidelines. And if you think back to probably about 1.5 to 2 years ago, the urine mandatory guidelines were issued in their final form. And now we've got the oral fluid. So we've got one for urine and one for oral fluid. We have will be two separate collection handbooks. The urine collection handbook is already out there. It's been updated a number of times. The oral fluid handbook will be forthcoming. We will have one combined MRO manual, one combined chain of custody form, and all of these things, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but all of these things are being worked on right now with separate subgroups. RTI is really heading that process and working with the labs and the MROs directly on much of this. As I mentioned, proposed hair guidelines were published a couple of months ago, back mid-September, September 10th. And as we speak, the comment period is coming to an end. And so the next step, and it will be the same thing that happened with oral fluid a few years ago, actually I believe it was 2015, and with urine about the same time, is HHS, SAMHSA will go back, they'll look at all the public comments that have been posted, and I do keep track. There's quite a number of them at this point in time, so they've got their work cut out kind of sifting through all of the comments. They'll take a look at those, they'll make the adjustments needed, and then they'll go back through an approval and routing process. And this process, there's no rhyme or reason. We don't really know how long it's going to take, but it did take several years for oral fluids. So knock on wood, it doesn't take quite that long for hair testing, but that's basically the process. One thing I want to note here, and we'll cover it in a little more detail, the guidelines that issued as final last October cover the federal employees. DOT will have a separate rulemaking process, and I'll walk you through that in a few minutes. But that's a very clear delineation we need to make, that this is really only for federal employees at this point in time. When you look at kind of, where oral fluid and urine can be used, they can be used in exactly the same circumstances. And you'll see that listed here. Basically all types of testing, from pre-employment to random, reasonable suspicion, as well as post-accident return to duty and follow-up. The hair testing guidelines, at least as they're proposed currently, again, HHS will need to look at the comments and weigh in on whether they need to change this. But what they're proposing is for pre-employment and random only. And if you think back to the chart that Brian talked about a little bit ago with the window of detection, one of the reasons that I believe they're not looking at something, in the shorter time frame is, as Brian mentioned, it does take a little bit longer for drugs to appear in the hair. So when you think about a post-accident type test, where you're looking for very recent use, you may not necessarily see that with a hair test. And so that's one of the reasons that they've kind of restricted that. So it'll be interesting to see when the final guidelines issue, how they handle that. From a general overview perspective, the initial drug test, just like Brian mentioned, and with urine, can be an immunoassay, or it can be an alternative technology. And for oral fluid testing, that typically means LCMS. Usually we hear terms like GCMS referred to for urine, but for oral fluid, we see LCMS more often than not, although both can be used. So you can actually use LC-GC for your screening technology as well as your confirmation technology. We do know the guidelines do not allow for point-of-care rapid testing. This is laboratory-based testing only, similar to urine. And we do know that FDA-cleared devices are to be used, and they must be single-use, so you can't use them multiple times. So it's use once, then if you need to retest the next person, you need to use another one. All collections are required to be split. And if you think about the slide that Brian showed a little bit ago with the devices, you could spit into a tube, and one of the pictures that he showed actually had a tube with kind of two tubes. So as you spit, your sample is split into those two, so that would qualify. Or you could use a pad type device and have two pads, two devices in your mouth, either simultaneously or serially. Now, remember I talked about federal versus DOT. This is again for federal. DOT typically has a rule, and we haven't seen the rulemaking come out, but typically they have a rule that it must be simultaneous. So we'll have to see as DOT comes out what that looks like. But from a federal perspective, it could be serially as well as simultaneously. And as with urine testing, HHS certified laboratories are required. If you look at the collection device requirements, again, we talked about single use. The device must have an indicator, and that indicator is really designed to show how much oral fluid has been collected and that you've actually reached that collection point. So the guidelines talk about 1 ml being required. So many of the devices that are out on the market today or will be coming out on the market have a blue dye or some type of a colored dye that indicates once 1 ml of sample has been collected. The vial, the collection vial, especially for those that need to go back into the laboratory, must be sealable and non-leaking. So that can be a screw tap or a flip top. Doesn't matter. They don't call that out, but it has to make sure, you have to make sure that it does not leak. You must maintain specimen integrity. So that would be your chain of custody seal. Again, no different than you would use with a urine test. And obviously you have to look at metabolite for the drugs, metabolite stability, and there can't be any substantial impact on the composition of the drugs or drug metabolites. So as we think about what those drugs look like, you know, what would you be testing for? There's kind of a long list here. It's funny, for those of us that have been in the industry a long time, we remember the old NIDA 5, which now they refer to the SAMHSA 5 as the main class of 5 drugs. But what we've seen over the years is that the number of drugs that you actually test for is more than 5. And that's because you've got an opiate class that looks for oxycodone, looks for 6-acetylmorphine, might look for hydrocodone in addition to opiates. Same thing for amphetamines. You might have methamphetamine, MDMA. So the list is a little bit longer than 5, but the class in and of itself is still 5 drugs. This chart just shows you, and it's probably more detail than many of you would need to know, but this is what your labs are going to go by. One of the very nice things about what the guidelines are doing, they are actually standardizing the cutoffs. Prior to this, basically a lab could run any oral fluid test at whatever cutoff they wanted. And so they may vary. So marijuana, as an example here, you see the initial test cutoff for the guidelines is 4 nanograms. Some assays have a 3 nanogram cutoff. Some have a 4 nanogram cutoff. Some are maybe a little bit higher or lower. So this will standardize oral fluid testing, much like urine has standardized cutoffs and has for many, many years. The implementation timeline, this is a good one to talk a little bit about, because there's a number of different timelines here and it can be a little bit confusing. So again, I mentioned that the guidelines issued last year, October of last year. They issued with an effective date of January 1st, 2020. But there's also an implementation time frame, and this is no different than we saw with urine testing. It will be the same thing when we get to hair testing or any other testing methodologies that the government might look for in the future. There's always at least a 12, sometimes as long as 18 months, maybe even a little bit longer implementation period. And really what that does is it gets everyone prepared. So the cutoffs that I just mentioned on the slide before, all the manufacturers that currently make drug testing reagents have to adhere to those cutoffs. And for many of those manufacturers, they may not currently have that cutoff level. Remember when I said THC could be 3 or 4? So if you have a cutoff of 3, now you have to change that cutoff to 4. So there's some work that manufacturers need to do to get their product in line, not only from a cutoff perspective, but they have to look at cross-reactivity profiles and a number of other things. And that's just the assays. They also have to look at the device. So it takes time to get that done, and then everything's got to go through the FDA. And then once that happens, the laboratories need to do their proficiency testing. So there are a number of things that have to be set and put in place, and that's why there's a little bit of an implementation period. So we do know also that the laboratories have to be certified as far as HHS is concerned, and that proficiency testing is a part of that. Every month you can go on to the HHS website and look at the number of certified labs that are out there. And they have been listing for the better part of this year oral fluids, but there are currently no labs certified. And that's because the manufacturers haven't quite done what they need to do from a development perspective, and the labs still have to go through their certification process. And we're still within that implementation window. So it will be likely next year sometime before labs are certified to be able to accept oral fluid samples. When you look at Department of Transportation, remember I had mentioned that we were talking about federal guidelines here. So this covers your federal government workforce. What about the DOT? So the DOT obviously is the larger part when you look at mandated testing. There's over 6 million tests done on an annual basis. So the DOT, just like they do for urine, will engage in a full rulemaking process. And that will begin with the notice of proposed rulemaking. to revise CFR, the 49 CFR Part 40. And so we do know that there is a placeholder for that within the DOT, but they have not actively started that. So we assume at some point in the near future, they'll start that rulemaking. And then what they will do is they will post that proposed rulemaking, as they've done oftentimes with urine. They'll post that for comments. There'll be a comment period. They will then take those comments, make any adjustments, and then again, they will go through their implementation point in time. So we're probably a good 1.5 to 2 years, more than likely, for the DOT to be able to send in samples to laboratories, just because they're a little bit further behind than the feds are. So, you know, we've got a little bit of time to wait. I know there's a lot of people, especially in oil and gas, they do follow some of the DOT guidelines, but there's still some time that needs to elapse before that can happen. What about non-regulated testing? So Brian talked a little bit right at the end of his presentation about different market segments. And there are a lot of different market segments, especially in the workplace, that are actually doing oral fluid testing today. And there's no reason they cannot continue to do that. You know, one of the nice things is that the guidelines serve essentially as an official endorsement by the federal government. You know, in a bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the feds put into their executive summary as to reasons why they approved oral fluid. Many employers, you know, will look at those reasons and say, here's a third party saying that oral fluid is scientifically sound and it has a lot of good advantages that I should consider it. So there are a lot of employers, at least, you know, we've heard over the number of years, that were hesitant to move to oral fluids until the government endorsed it. So we now do have that endorsement, and we do believe that a number of employers that maybe had been sitting on the sidelines a little bit will start looking at oral fluid, even though, you know, they don't necessarily need to wait. And one last point here, lab-based oral fluid is permitted in 48 states. So the majority of the United States at this point in time is free to perform oral fluid testing. So I mentioned SAMHSA looking at, you know, in their executive summary and their preamble, some of the reasons for oral fluid testing and why they looked at it. I'll go through these fairly quickly. Brian's addressed a number of them in his slides. But again, this is in the guideline document. So we took direct quotes out of there. So they do provide flexibility by permitting different specimen types. And certainly with hair testing being on the horizon, not only will employers have to choose from oral fluid and urine, eventually they'll have to choose a third option as well. And that provides a lot of flexibility. We know that oral fluid can be collected in various settings. So collect anytime, anywhere. You could collect off-site at a collection site, but you could also collect on-site. And that's real helpful for a lot of those workplaces that perhaps are a little bit remote. Time savings, again, don't necessarily have to go to a dedicated collection site. So this is definitely, when you think about having to send somebody, if you're in a remote location, your nearest collection site could be a half an hour away, maybe even longer. What if it's a third shift and at night and your collection site's not open, and you might need to have to look for, a hospital to send somebody to if you're worried about a post-accident test. A couple of the other reasons, again, versatility in detection. Brian talked about the window of detection. So when you look at kind of all three matrices and you look at oral fluid is really the first one that shows you what's happened very recently. Urine shows you what's happened within a little bit longer time frame. And then certainly hair tells you from a much longer perspective. And so there's, again, a good versatility in being able to look at drug testing along the entire spectrum of time. Brian also talked about adulteration, so it decreases invalid tests from substitution or adulteration, and then the cost benefits. The government did a lot of different, I guess they looked at different estimates, and they figure somewhere between 400,000 and 1.2 million on an annual basis is what they'd save by moving people to an oral fluid methodology. And I think a lot of those savings come from collection sites and some of the fees, again, especially if you have to use a hospital for a third shift or something like that. So as we look to, is it all or one? Is it only, okay, I've done urine forever, I might be interested in oral fluid, do I have to switch everybody? Not necessarily. If you're worried about, privacy, gender concerns, adulteration and cheating, recent use versus historical use, or shy bladder, oral fluid could be a very good answer for you. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only answer. If you think about a few other conditions, if you think about mixing it up a little bit, there's no reason that you can't not have, a combination of urine and oral fluid, and eventually probably hair. So if you think about combining different methods, again, think about the different methods that are out there. Hair, we talked about, not necessarily good for very recent use, but very good for historical use. Urine, as you think about linking to impairment, we all know that there's, perhaps some issues with urine, especially with marijuana. It can show in someone's urine for 5, 7, 10 days, perhaps even longer. So as we start getting into more and more of the states that are looking at legalizing marijuana, how can you tell if somebody has used over the weekend on their own time and now they've been drug tested, a couple of days later? Oral fluid definitely will show marijuana out of a person's system within about a day to 2 days, whereas it will stay a little bit longer with urine. So that could be a situation where you might want to look at oral fluid. And as far as I think we've got one more slide to finish up. That's our last slide. So I'm going to transition to drug testing during COVID. And this section's really, there's a couple of slides on just drug testing itself, and then we're going to talk a little bit about COVID testing. So laboratory-based testing, we have talked a lot about, it can be conducted anywhere, anytime, and not necessarily using an offsite collection facility. So one of the things that we have heard from our clients since the pandemic started back in March and has kind of continued, and it looks like it's ramping up, some collection sites have been impacted where they're either closed or they have narrowing hours of being able to take collection. So a methodology where you can do an on-site test is a really interesting way to think about testing during a pandemic. The other nice thing about oral fluid testing, and I don't know that we've gotten into a lot of detail on this, but Brian, I think, mentioned it does allow for 6 feet of separation. It is a very donor-driven process. So the donor, the employee, actually takes the device out of the package. They insert the device in their mouth for collection. They then insert that device into the vial, seal the vial, and put it in the lab pack. All of that can be done within that 6 feet of distance, with the collector maintaining that, distance from them. They don't have to be right up. Little bit different when you talk about hair testing, where the person has to be a little closer, and even urine testing, when you think about, what that observation looks like. There may be some circumstances where that could be a little bit of a challenge. So one of the things, obviously, we do recommend is the collector should be looking at PPE and wearing the appropriate PPE if necessary. If you look kind of at urine and oral fluid, and we've touched on a little bit of this, one thing perhaps that we haven't necessarily touched on is if you're using a common restroom site or area, as we think about everything with COVID and what you're having to do from a sanitation perspective, it then becomes an onus on the collection site to make sure that they're going into that restroom after each and every person is in there to wipe down anything that person may touch, whether it be the toilet handle, the sink handles, things like that. So in order to truly make sure that, you're not worrying about any kind of contamination, that's something that should be a consideration. With oral fluid, you don't necessarily have to do that. Again, it's very donor driven. You don't necessarily need to have that offsite collection. And one thing that's very interesting that is coming up a lot with our customers is remote video observed collections. And so we kind of think about this new telehealth world that we're in. In fact, we're coming to you virtually because we can't all meet in person. And probably for the foreseeable future, that's going to continue happening. And so we've had a number of customers talk about doing telehealth, whether that be using Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, or applications like Proof, which is a video observed collection with an app on your phone. So these are things that are coming up in not only workplace, but other areas like drug treatment, as a way around, having to be face to face with people. And so basically you would send the collection device to the person, whether it be to their home or somewhere remotely. And just as we're doing today, they would be kind of viewing the presentation live with that person. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as the pandemic wanes down sometime next year. Will telehealth still continue to play a part? I think we've got some customers that think that it definitely will. One thing that we do know, and we've seen a lot of different reports, that substance abuse is going to continue to increase. Over the last 6 months, both drug and alcohol testing positive rates have skyrocketed. And, a lot of people deal with things in different ways. And unfortunately, with, substance use, we're seeing those people now returning to work. So it's important to really continue to think about testing from a drug testing perspective. I know in times like this, we just want to get people back to work, but we also want to get them back to work safely. And so not only, safely means continuing to drug test, but it also means drug testing safely as well. So one message we really want to impart with everyone is please continue to be diligent, not only about your drug testing policies and continuing to do that, but as you're doing it, making sure that you're, using safe PPE, maintaining that 6 feet of distance as best you can, and keeping yourself and your employees safe. With that, we'll transition into COVID testing. I've got just a couple of slides on COVID testing. And I think there've been probably some other presentations that have talked a little bit about COVID, so I won't take a whole lot of time. But what you see here, and I think you'll all get a copy of this presentation, are the various ways that you can actually test for COVID. So the nasal pharyngeal or NP swabs are what's most commonly used for PCR testing. PCR testing is what's most commonly used for active infection. You can also use, in some cases, a throat that's called an oral pharyngeal swab or a nasal swab. But typically, those are done by an NP swab. You can, like a flu test, there are some antigen tests that also look for live virus that are using now nasal or throat swabs as well. And you can also use oral fluid or blood. Oral fluid can be used for both the PCR testing as well as antibody testing. And blood testing is used primarily for antibody testing as well. So pros and cons, you can kind of lump these into comfortable versus not so comfortable. When you think about nasal pharyngeal, nasal or throat swabs, a couple of things to think about. In order to do that, you've got to be very close again to somebody, kind of up in their face. So that 6 feet of separation is difficult to continue to manage. And also there is some level of discomfort when you're talking about, and I luckily have not had to have an NP swab done, but I've had a number of friends and family that have, and it's really rough getting all the way up. You've got to really dig to get up in there to get the viral antigen or the pieces and parts for PCR. So there is a level of discomfort there. When you think about oral fluid, it's a throat swab or a spit type test. Again, the same thing we see with drug testing is kind of the same thing we're seeing with COVID testing. It's a pretty easy and non-invasive process. Again, same thing with drug testing. It allows that 6 feet of separation and distance as well. And blood testing, while many of us are very used to getting our fingers pricked for blood draws, whether it be, just for cholesterol or a number of various conditions, again, that is a fairly close process. You've got to be close to the donor at that point in time. Testing specimens, again, we touched on a little bit. So if you're looking for active virus, you're definitely looking for either a PCR or an antigen test. PCR testing is typically laboratory-based testing. Antigen testing right now is becoming more prevalent, really over the last several weeks to months. Abbott's got their Binax Now product out there. There are several others that are truly rapid point of care tests. So you're getting a result in 15 or 20 minutes. Whereas PCR laboratory based, it's typically a day, 2, sometimes 3 to get that result back, but they're looking for active infection. Antibody testing, also known as serology testing, is looking at if a donor has had a past infection. And antibody testing can be either blood or oral fluid in general. And eventually what we're hearing is they're looking at, I know there are some manufacturers looking at trying to test for both active, and that could be antigen as well as antibody, or it could be a combination of a PCR test as well as an antibody test. So that's more of an up and coming, but I think it's definitely something that we'll see very shortly on the horizon. Practical considerations, there are a number of employers that are actually thinking about, should I be testing for COVID? If you are, a couple of things to consider, and this is really no different than we think about with drug testing. You want to look for a device that's FDA cleared. And we're typically used to seeing 510K clearances for drug testing. Right now, what we're seeing is EUA, emergency use authorization. And that's basically what the FDA does in the time of a crisis or a pandemic. It happened with Ebola a couple of years ago, Zika as well. So the first step is an EUA, FDA clearance, and then eventually you'll see 510K. If you're going to do a lab-based test, work with a lab that you know and trust. Many of your drug testing labs, CRL as an example, Quest, LabCorp also do COVID testing. So stick with what you know. Avoid unproven devices. One thing we learned very early on in the April to May timeframe, there was a flood of the market of some of these rapid point of care antibody tests from overseas, let's just say, that didn't perform well at all. They had sensitivity and specificity rates well under 50%. And so we want to be careful of avoiding those things. And so really, you do want to check sensitivity and specificity. Check the package insert, understand what you're looking at. The FDA minimum requirement for antibody test as well as PCR test is 95% specificity and 90% sensitivity. So make sure you're looking at tests that at least meet that minimum standard. So with that, I think we've got a couple of questions. So Thomas, I'm going to send it back to you. And let's see what the audience has been asking.
So before we get into questions, we got a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions that you want to ask or ask throughout the presentation, we're going to get through as many as we can. I know we've got a bunch of questions. We're going to fly through them as quickly as possible. If we don't get to your question, we'll answer it after the Day with DISA conference and reach back out to you. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, we've got that under the materials section at the bottom right. Just click on that and you'll be able to download a PDF. With that, Brian, Jackie, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. Just a couple of quick questions. Are there any ways that people can beat their oral fluid drug test?
Good question. And what we've heard in the past is that that's a very difficult thing to do. And it all ties back to that direct observation part of the collection. Because they're being directly observed, it's hard for them to put anything in their mouth or have anything in their mouth. And part of the protocol under the new guidelines will be that the observer of the collection will actually do a quick inspection of the oral fluid cavity to make sure there's nothing in the mouth.
Does someone collecting need official training in a collection for oral fluid, or can anyone do it if they follow the 3 steps you guys outlined?
Well, so, past versus present. So in the past, we have created materials for doing the collection steps one by one, where it's preparation for the collection and what you need to gather to prepare for that collection, having everything on hand, observing, checking the expiration date on the device, making sure you're using a valid device, checking the donor ID. So while the steps are 1, 2, 3, there is built-in materials that we've created either in hard copy or video format that take someone through that training. It's very quick, it's very easy, but that training is required to say that someone can and should be doing and observing a collection. Of course, as we get to the federal and the regulated guidelines, there will be, stricter guidelines in terms of what you have to follow, and there will be training that will be rolled out by the industry groups, and I'm sure we'll be part of that as well. So, yeah, you want to make sure you're doing it right. We've got materials and have modeled what you do for a collection, and that will only continue to be rolled out as we get into the regulated testing markets.
Can you guys test for CBD with oral fluid?
Well, so the CBD question is interesting. It's come up a number of times recently because of the fact that I think you have individuals that are taking CBD and coming up positive for marijuana and using that as a reason for a positive drug screen, which really is not allowable. You cannot use a positive THC screen. The excuse that you're taking a CBD product, and that's why you have a positive THC screen. The problem is that products that are out there are not well quality controlled, or not all of them are well quality controlled. You're supposed to have 0.3% THC, the active parent compound, in that CBD product in order for it to qualify and to be a valid CBD product, but also to help you avoid a positive drug screen. And so what's happening is you're finding products that are much higher than that in THC content. People are taking them, they come up positive on their drug screen.
Yeah, and I know we've had a couple other sessions that address that, and it's kind of the wild, wild west out there where there's not a lot of regulation around CBD oil and what
Correct.
exactly is in each one. And so it's kind of a buyer beware situation, unfortunately.
Exactly, yeah.
Jackie, I think this question is probably targeted towards your segment of the portion of the presentation. Can you start using oral fluid tests for regulated testing today?
So again, I think in the slides, I talked about the difference between federal and DOT. So the oral fluid guidelines that issued last year are available now for federal workers once that implementation period is up. So technically the answer is a yes and a no. The yes part of it is for federal employees, yes, but the labs are not ready to accept samples because that implementation period has not finished up yet. So we would expect that to be probably sometime next year. The DOT side of the house has to go through their own rulemaking, and that is just in the kind of beginning stages. So it's going to be quite some time yet before DOT is allowed to use oral fluid.
Okay, I have a couple other questions in that same vein of, would the same testing device be used for DOT and federal? I know you mentioned some differences that might pop up, like doing simultaneous testing versus concurrent.
Yeah, and I think again, a lot depends on what test what device you're currently using. So some of the devices on the market would already be fitting for, they would meet the specifications. Other devices, again, perhaps not. If your device does not currently have an indicator or doesn't collect 1 ml of sample, then you would have to use a different device. I can speak to OraSure as an example. Many people are aware and using the Intercept device, which does not have an indicator. So we are working, and we do have a device that we will be commercializing, which is called I2, and that does have a indicator and collect the required 1 ml of sample.
Now, in your presentation, you had said 48 states allow oral fluid testing. Which states do not allow oral fluid testing, and will the oral fluid guidelines change that potentially?
Yep, that's actually a really good question. So the two states are Hawaii and Maine. And in the case of Hawaii, actually the guidelines will clear that up. There are a number of states, and actually Vermont is one of them, that technically oral fluid testing is allowed, but the health department, and this is what we see with Hawaii as well, defers to the mandatory guidelines. So there's sort of a cause and effect there. So currently, yes, there are two states that do not allow it. Vermont has some restrictions. But the guidelines in and of themselves will clear up for most of those states that have issues.
Great information, extremely impactful presentation. Thank you so much for giving us a couple of minutes of your time. Any final words as we part ways?
I'd just like to thank DISA again and all the attendees. You know, DISA's a wonderful group out there doing what you guys do and offering all the services you do. And you know, it's difficult to pull something like this together for the industry, and I just commend you on that. So thank you to you, and thanks to the audience for listening in on these. It's much appreciated by us.
Yep, absolutely. I second that, and hopefully in 2021 we'll see everybody live and not virtual.
Yes, that's absolutely our hope. That is absolutely our hope. Well, hey, thank you again to everyone attending today. We hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions throughout the week. Have a great one.